Albert Camus' The Plague is a harrowing novel about an epidemic that spreads in a town called Oran in French Algeria. Although it was published in 1947 and takes place in a region on the North African coast, it is a prescient example of what James Joyce meant when he said that in the particular is contained the universal. In other words, this town is your town. This epidemic is this pandemic. Long before this coronavirus, Albert Camus saw into the heart of how such epidemics affect human beings as well as entire societies, and here is what he has to teach us. In the beginning, a wave of something like panic swept the town. There was a demand for drastic measures. The authorities were accused of slackness, and people who had houses on the coast spoke of moving there, early in the year though it was. For Camus, who was an absurdist writer, that is, he held the universe to be devoid of any inherent meaning, the way that people structure their lives and their societies, what he calls their habits, your habits, are essentially a veil, a wall obscuring this fact of meaninglessness from you. But when plague or epidemic arrives, it disturbs this fabric, tears it up, and exposes life as the chaos that it is, by removing your protection from not so much the disease, but the naked reality of life's essential caprice and meaninglessness. This is normal everyday habit as distraction, a distraction which, once removed, has the power to enlighten us all. And so he writes, "Still, if things had gone thus far and no farther, force of habit would doubtless have gained the day as usual. But other members of our community, not all menials or poor people, were to follow the path down which Monsieur Michel, the first person who died of the plague in the novel, had led the way. And it was then that fear, and with fear, serious reflection began." According to Camus, such crises serve to amplify both the worst and the best aspects of human beings, and our actions in such times of upheaval and mortal trepidation emphasize the underlying moral character which smooth social order was able to formally obscure. And so, the panic and fear of pandemic can lead, as Camus saw, to some of the most contemptible behavior, as we have seen with coronavirus. Profiteers were taking a hand and purveying at enormous prices essential foodstuffs not available in the shops. The result was that poor families were in great straits while the rich went short of practically nothing. Diagnosing this predilection in people, one of the other questions his novel ponders is, will we face this disease with selfish opportunism or with human solidarity? There has been, if you've noticed, a pressing metaphor that has spread throughout the world as fast as coronavirus itself. It is a description of the efforts against coronavirus as war. Camus writes, "Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we feel it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. And so we wait for swift victory against this invisible enemy. But the wars of the past have proved the victory is not always as swift as we initially would like to think." He continues, "When a war breaks out, people say, it's too stupid, it can't last long. But though a war may well be too stupid, that doesn't prevent its lasting. Stupidity has a knack of getting its way, as we should see if we were not always so wrapped up in ourselves." So Camus thinks the plagues and pandemics act as a kind of microscope, magnifying our natures as well as our illusions, some of them necessary for our survival. In this respect, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists. They disbelieved in pestilences. A pestilence isn't a thing made to man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away, but it doesn't always pass away, and from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away, and the humanists first of all, because they haven't taken their precautions. At this very moment, dare I say it, you are seeing this either from isolation or after having been isolated. But the question right now on most people's minds all over the planet is, how long will this lockdown last? Camus wrote, when the most pessimistic had fixed it at, say, 6 months, some friend they met, an article in a newspaper, a vague suspicion or a flash or foresight would suggest that, after all, there was no reason why the epidemic shouldn't last more than 6 months. Why not a year, or even more? Camus knew that because it is impossible to see the big picture, because we are both confined by physical isolation, and because we are susceptible to illusions, we have, it is true for the most part, a sort of faith that it will end at some allotted time that we have psychologically formulated and held on to. Otherwise, we would go mad. And holding on to that allotted time is an act of faith. As for the instinctively faithful, well, for the worst of them, for those unable to temper their fear and understand the roots of their emotions altogether, Camus saw all too easily the type of reaction that their fear would lead to. When Father Panelot, the local fiery Jesuit priest, delivers a sermon during the plague, he says, "Calamity has come to you, my brethren, and, my brethren, you deserved it." And so, as was seen by Camus, and as is seen now, in such times the religious zealots set themselves up all the more against both reason and scientific efforts. But of course, ultimately it will be medicine and not prayer that defeats coronavirus, as it was medicine and not prayer that beat the plague. Camus understood such types to separate themselves from the rest of humanity, especially in times of crisis, because they imagine that if they can feel that they are above or apart from the rest, then their fate will be different too. Father Panelot dies like all the other plague victims. No longer were there individual destinies, only a collective destiny made of plague and the emotions shared by all. This self-isolation is, although necessary, something which weighs heavily on us. In Camus' novel, the inhabitants of the town are isolated away from everyone outside. The gates are closed. With us, it is our front doors that are closed to the outside world. And this isolation, one way or another, this exile, as Camus put it, has cut off so many of us from our loved ones. And it is this exile from loved ones, family, friends, lovers, that is taking its toll on our spirits more than anything else. A loveless world is a dead world, and always there comes an hour when one is weary of prisons, of one's work, and of devotion to duty, and all one craves for is a loved face, the warmth and wonder of a loving heart. Perhaps the most outrageous and unforgivable aspect of this coronavirus pandemic is the shameful lack of resources provided for our doctors, our nurses, and all our medical staff who are fighting for us on the front lines of this illness, without adequate masks, aprons, gloves, eye protection, and essential protective equipment. In modern times and to modern minds, this is a disgrace and has far-reaching consequences. Rambert, a journalist who came into town for work but gets trapped inside during the lockdown, says to our protagonist, the Dr. Ryu, "Is the epidemic getting out of hand?" Ryu said it wasn't that. Indeed, the death graph was rising less steeply, only they lacked adequate means of coping with the disease. We're short of equipment. In all the armies of the world, a shortage of equipment is usually compensated for by manpower, but we're short of manpower too. It's barely enough to cope with the present state of affairs, and it will be inadequate if things get worse. Our journalist, Rambert, has a lover outside of the town where he is trapped. For a long swathe of the story, he does nothing but plan his escape, repeatedly saying, "But I don't belong here," so that he can get back to a state of peace and happiness. But as he helps Dr. Ryu with the sick, something changes in him, and he tells Dr. Ryu that he has decided to stay and fight the disease. To which Dr. Ryu says, "There is nothing shameful in preferring happiness." "Certainly," Rambert replied, "but it may be shameful to be happy by oneself." You need not, like Rambert or Dr. Ryu, fight this pandemic on the front lines of hospitals, with the medics or with so many others risking their lives every single day and indeed dying, trying to save ours. But I also hope that we are decent enough to have had, at least for a fleeting moment, a tinge of regret that we have not been able to fight alongside them, those we have called our heroes. But such is the nature of this virus that just to remain at home is equivalent to taking an active role in this struggle and requires a decency and ethics to stay put. There's one thing I must tell you. There's no question of heroism in all this. It's a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile, but the only means to fighting a plague is common decency.